Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Petro-Teach webinar on understanding fluid contact, free water level, oil water contact, and transition intervals in oil reservoirs by Jean-Marie QUESTIAUX. My name is Hassan Karimai, represent Petro-Teach today and act as facilitator in this webinar. As you already heard from the organizer, you are entering as listening only mode and muted. Before we proceed the event, let us check if you receive my voice properly. There is a window in front of your platform, and by clicking on the arrow, you will see the full window version with a chat box. Please type the word hi or hello or something so that we make sure we have established the full communication. Okay, seems everything is okay. So the outline of the two-day webinar begins with a brief introduction to Petro-Teach, and then we introduce our distinguished instructor, Jean-Marie QUESTIAUX. Next, we follow and listen to the webinar lecture, which lasts about 30 to 45 minutes. And finally, we will have Q&A session for approximately 10 to 15 minutes. So, Petro-Teach is a global provider of high-quality training solutions to the oil and gas industry. Currently, we are providing about 200 training courses by up to 60 distinguished lecturers with high track record from both academia and industry. Our training styles include online, public, and in-house courses. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Petro-Teach was more focused on the distance learning during last 2 years. However, we are happy to inform that we have established again our face-to-face courses in different locations for the year 2022, while keeping virtual-led instructor possibility option for our clients. For more information, please visit our website and download the course catalog. You may also follow us in social media such as LinkedIn, and do not forget to watch our videos on the Petro-Teach YouTube channel. So the event today is part of the webinar series that Petro-Teach is offering during this year. And Jean-Marie QUESTIAUX, expert in reservoir engineering, will talk about free water level, oil water contact, and transition intervals. So we welcome Jean-Marie and pleased that he can join us today. Jean-Marie holds a bachelor degree in geology from the University of Cape Town and an MSc in reservoir engineering from the University of Heriot-Watt. He has over 40 years of oil field experience, 17 years with Petrofina Total, initially in exploration, then moving to production and development in 2002. He has competences over geology, petrophysics, geophysics, reservoir engineering, production technology, petroleum engineering, economics, as well as operations from well site duties to geostream. His experience includes new and brownfield developments, infield drilling, EOR, well stimulation, shut-in wells, reassessment, well intervention projects, production optimization, near field appraisal, and reservoir management. He is experienced in annual reserve estimation, production forecast, business plans, and corporate strategy for production and reserves growth. He occupied roles including General Manager Exploration, General Manager Development, and Technical Director, and his areas of experience includes Africa, Nigeria, Congo, Angola, South Africa, Libya, South America, like Bolivia, North Sea, and also Australia. So today, Jean-Marie will share with us his intimate knowledge of the topic. So let's move to the presentation. I want to remind you all that you can post your questions using the same chat box introduced at the beginning. At the Q&A session after the lecture, they will be answered. So I'm going to give the floor to Jean-Marie to address his presentation. Here you are, Jean-Marie.
Thank you very much, Hassan. So I will get straight into...
Can you share your screen?
Yes. Can you see my screen?
Not yet. Let me stop my share. Yes, now we can see.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Hassan, for the introduction. Indeed, I have lectured for Petro-Teach about a year ago in Norway, so I know Hassan pretty well. But anyway, let's start with the webinar and the content. What I'm hoping to do is we'll discuss fluid contacts. We'll be looking at free water level, oil water contacts, transition intervals. We'll be looking at pressure gradients in reservoirs. Of course, if you're looking at capillary pressures and transition zones, you've got to have a little understanding of wettabilities. Then we look at how these contacts and the transition intervals that we are considering are dependent on reservoir qualities, and how it's related as well to relative permeability curves, and how all this is combined and are all interrelated. I'll conclude with the importance of correctly integrating fluid contacts and transition intervals, especially when you're doing dynamic flow simulation and initialization. And then we'll have a very brief look at the impact of transition intervals on volumetrics and perforation intervals. So let's start with a little mind exercise, if you don't mind. Let's imagine we have a tank which is filled with 3 fluid components. They're non-miscible, so you've got water, oil, and gas. If you're allowing the system to come into equilibrium because of gravity and because of density, you'll have the water overlain by the oil, overlain by the gas. The contact between them, because they're immiscible, are sharp as a pin, like a slice, like a piece of paper. So it's very clear, the contacts, you can see them in fact quite clearly. But what happens if you were to drill a well and take pressure measurements where you see these different yellow arrows in the different component? Well, you'd see different gradients. At the bottom where you'd see the water gradient, then you would see an intersection with the oil gradient and an intersection with the gas gradient. The intersection between these 2 gradients are sharp, and there's no transition because obviously you're looking at a tank. Okay, so here we see no transition whatsoever, but we can pinpoint the free water level very accurately as we can the gas-oil contact. Now, what happens when this reservoir is not empty, it's not a tank, but it's actually filled with sand, and you still have water, oil, and gas? What happens at the contact? That's really what is of interest to us. Obviously, the fact that you now have reservoir rock influence how these contacts are between themselves, and we'll have a look and try and understand what happens to the pressure and the gradients and how the contacts are affected. That's the purpose of this webinar. So for the purpose of this exercise as well, I'd like you to imagine that we have a reservoir very much like you see in front of you. It's basically a tank, but you can see that it's divided into 4 different segments. The left-hand side has got absolutely no rock. It's just clear, no rock at all. Then in the second quarter, you can see pretty coarse sand. And then you see a medium grain sand after that, and then a fine grain sand. And you can see that as you're going from left to right, from the coarse sand, you're losing poroperm properties. In other words, your porosity and permeability are decreasing. But even though I've put dashed lines, we're assuming that everything is in communication. There is no barriers between them. They're simply all together in the same tank. So we've got a system which is in equilibrium. What happens at the contacts? Obviously, capillary effects will become apparent in the rocks, and that's what we'd like to start is by looking at what are these capillary effects that we're talking about. Well, what affects capillary effects is obviously the rock wettability, and there's 2 things you have to remember. The wetting phase is the one that spreads over the solid surface and preferentially wets the solid. In other words, the wettability is the attraction of the fluid to the solid. Okay, so if you have, for instance, water inside a sand reservoir. Sand is water wet. The water will tend to cling to it. It's like water clinging to glass. Glass is also water wet. If you spray water on a piece of glass, you'll find that the water will stick to it. Okay, and the way it sticks to it and the way we can see the wettability is simply by looking at how it spreads, and you can see the contact angle shown to you. So you can see quite clearly that the water is clinging to the rock surface, it's spreading itself, and the oil is the non-wetting phase. If instead of having a piece of glass, you have a piece of Teflon or a surface which is covered with Teflon, the water will not cling to it. You will find that the water is actually being repelled by that surface. And that means that the water is the non-wetting phase. In other words, it does not cling to the surface in which it is in contact. And that's important, of course, in terms of looking at capillary pressures. So this is a busy slide, but it's trying to explain to you in layman's term, what is the capillary forces. So imagine now you have a beaker which has got water, and on top of that, it's got oil, and you're now taking some capillary tubes like glass, and you were to lower it and intersect the free water level, in other words, the surface between the oil and the water. In the case of the glass, because the glass is water wet, you will find that the water will rise up into this tube, like you can see on the left-hand side. And the height at which it rises depends very much on two things. First of all, the radius of the tube that you're using. And secondly, the contrast, the density contrast between the oil and the water. Okay, but the reason the water is rising in the tube is because you've got the wetness, in other words, the adhesion of the water to the glass, it's attracted to the glass. And you've got the cohesion, which is the surface tension between the oil and the water. The contact between them is an effect of surface tension, and obviously it has to be sufficiently strong that it can actually push the oil up the tube to a certain height. The reverse, if you've got if you've got a tube or a capillary tube which is, for instance, made out of Teflon, in other words, it's repelling water, you'll find the complete opposite effect. In other words, the tube itself will repel the water and push it down away from the free water level, also to a certain height, which is, of course, depending, once again, to how strong the wetness is, and, of course, on the density contrast that you can see. So you've got, on the one hand, the wettability, which is affecting adhesion, and on the other one, you've got adhesion, and you've got either attraction or repulsion of the water. Okay, so if you look at the curve, the capillary curve, you can see that on the left-hand side, you've got the free water level, and more or less where the height is, that's where you start seeing that the curve goes to the left and starts increasing as you're going away from the oil-water contact. And you can see that on the right-hand side, where you've got a oil-wet reservoir, you can see that the oil-water contact is actually below the free water level, which is what the schematic is showing. Now, the height to which it goes, as we say, depends very much on the radius, and it can only go to a certain height, at which point you have an equilibrium between the adhesion, the cohesion, and gravity. Okay, so how high it goes depends very much on the radius of your tubes, the wettability of the tubes, the surface tension, and of course the fluid density or the contrast, and of course ultimately gravity. When all this is in equilibrium, your water will rise to that certain height. If we look in a little bit more detail, you can see that the oil pressure, which is, if you look in the central little schematic in the very center, you can see there's a gradient for the oil, which is a solid black line, up to the free water level, and then you've got the water line. If you're looking at all the points along that solid line, which is the oil gradient, This is the PO is equal to the pressure at the free water level minus the density of the oil times G, which is the gravity constant times height. So you can actually draw that line using that equation, and you can see that you can extend the water line, which is a solid line below the free water level and becomes a dashed line as you're going above the free water level, by using exactly the same equation, which is the pressure of the water phase is the pressure at the free water level minus the density of the water times G times H. In other words, this gradient that you see, the capillary pressure, is dependent entirely on the density contrast between the water and the oil. It does not matter what the rock type is, this is where your capillary pressure, and you can see that the capillary pressure is equal to 0 at the free water level. In other words, the pressure of the oil and the pressure of the water at the intersection are exactly the same. But as you're going above the free water level, you can see that the pressure in the oil phase is slightly higher than the water, and that's why you've got this capillary pressure, which allows the water to go up the tube, but to a certain height only, which is once again depending on getting equilibrium. So if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that capillary pressure can be generalized by simply looking at the density contrast between the water and the oil times the height times G. But if you look at the factor 2 psi times cos theta divided by the radius of the capillary tube, you can see that it is very much dependent, I beg your pardon, on the diameter of the tube, which means for the same capillary pressure, the height at which it goes depends very much and entirely, in fact, on the radius or the pore throat of your reservoir. So if you go to you simply rearrange the equation a little bit, and you can see at the bottom that the height at which it goes is dependent on, one, the surface tension and the wettability, divided by the density contrast and the radius of the capillary tube. And you can immediately see that the capillary tube, as they get smaller, or if you're looking at a rock, the pore throats get smaller, the height increases. But the capillary forces that are acting on the rock are exactly the same. Doesn't matter what your rock type is. But let's go back now to our example we were talking about. And you can see that we've got these 4 different blocks, all interconnected. And you can see that your transition zone or your capillary effect zone will be higher towards the finer grained material, and there will be none at the zone where there is no rock, because there is no capillary effect, because there are no solids on which the water can cling. So let's imagine now that we've now divided our reservoir, and you can see that we are now taking measurements, and we now have these gradients. Okay. If we were to drill 3 wells, one in the coarse sand, one in the medium grain sand, one in the fine sand, where would these points plot on the gradient? And you'll notice that they will all plot on exactly the same position. In other words, the fact that there is a transition zone does not affect the capillary pressure. The capillary pressure is fixed, and it is dependent very much on the contrast between the different densities, but the height at which it affects the water and the transition zone is indeed a function of the pore throat. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that you've got the water gradient, and you can see it dashed on this picture here, versus the oil. And you can see that the capillary effect will only be effective up to a certain height, which is relatively low for the good sands. In other words, the coarse sands with good poroperm. As the pore throat gets smaller and the poroperm gets poorer, you can see that the maximum, the height at which the capillary forces will be effective will be slightly higher, and will be even higher for the finer grain. Otherwise, everything else is exactly the same. So the capillary forces that are acting on these rocks are exactly the same, except that the height to which they are effective changes depending on the pore throat. Okay. So this is just a graph to show you the properties that you can expect. In other words, you can see that if you are at below the free water level, your saturation will be 1 because obviously there's no oil below that. If you are in the transition zone, which goes obviously from the free water level up to the top of the transition, in that case, you'll find that your saturation will be somewhere between 1, okay, which is at the free water level, up to SWIR, which is irreducible water saturation, okay? And we'll come back to that. So that's what happens in the transition zone. And once you're above the transition zone, your saturation will be constant, will be equivalent to SWIR, in other words, to the irreducible water saturation. So how do we actually measure and how do we estimate that? Well, here's an example from a well, it's actually from a field where they have measured from the logs a lot of the saturation versus height above the free water level. The free water level is a very easily, well, it's a firm depth which is at the intersection. In other words, that's one of your anchor points. And basically what they've seen is that as you're going up into the sequence, there is that hyperbolic curve which shows that the water saturation cannot go below this blue line that you see there. And you can see how as you're going away and as you're rising above the free water level, you can see how the saturation is increasing because of the capillary forces decreasing until you get to the top of the transition, at which point you have reached SWIR. What you can notice is that, in fact, the capillary curve is actually asymptotic. So it's a decision you have to make at which point you think that the SW is sufficiently low or has reached SWIR. So that is a user's decision. It's not, it's arbitrary. It's up to the user to decide. Somebody else could have decided that the top of the transition was maybe a little bit higher or a little bit lower than what has been. So that's one of the difficulties in terms of looking at transition zone is in fact where the oil-water contact is and where the top of the transition is. What is fixed, and that's your anchor point, is the free water level. That is fixed, and luckily for us, because that's how we can actually model and simulate because we've got that anchor point. So when we're looking at capillary, what I was showing you is that indeed, when you've got very good rocks, the irreducible water will be lower. So in this example, you can see that it can be as low as 10%, for instance. So in the phases 1, that's your good sands. And you can see that SWIR is relatively low. And you've got a oil-water contact, which is relatively deep compared, deep and relatively close to the free water level. The second phases that you see, the phases 2, are actually poorer reservoirs. And you can see that the SWIR is now higher. It's now around 20%. And you can see that the oil-water contact is slightly higher relative to the free water level. And the worst phases is number 3. You can see the oil-water contact is still higher and the SWIR is relatively high. It's about 30%. So free water level is fixed no matter what the rock type is. The top of the transition is where SW is equal to SWIR. And we assume that once you've reached SWIR, you will flow 100% oil. Everything between the top of the transition zone down to the free water level, you will flow both oil and water, with water becoming more, the fractional flow of water increasing as you're getting closer to the oil-water contact and to the free water level. So let's look in a little bit more detail the difference between free water level and the oil-water contact and the top of the transition zone. So here you're looking at a plot where you can see the different gradients on the right-hand side, and you can see the capillary pressure. And on the left-hand side, you can see the capillary pressure curve coming in, and you can see how as you moving up and above the free water level, which is the blue line that you can see how the capillary transition zone looks like until you reach the green horizontal line, which is basically where you've reached SWIR, or in this here it's written as SWC, which stands for connate water, but it's the same thing. So what you can see immediately is that the free water level is fixed, but the oil-water contact is actually the point on the curve, on the capillary curve, in which you estimate or you assume that you have, you've got, how can I say it? You've got detectable mobile oil occurs. In other words, it's a point at which you're saying that you are now starting to see significant amount of oil moving, okay? And that's a cutoff which, once again, is entirely dependent on the user. It's not fixed. In the example that you see here, I've actually put two of them. If you take the oil-water contact at 1, you're assuming that at this saturation, which is on the right-hand side, you're saying that we're now seeing detectable and noticeable amount of oil moving. If you go, but somebody may say, well, it's still too low. Maybe I'll go and take a higher saturation, and I will assume that everything below that height or with a saturation which is higher than that will not flow any significant amount of oil, and for practical purposes, you'll consider that to be 0. So you can see that the choice of the oil-water contact is entirely arbitrary. And what you see is in the water leg, you have the water is the continuous phase, and SW is 1. In the transitional zone, you're flowing both oil and water, and as you're going up towards the top of the transition zone, the fractional flow will move from 0% of oil towards 100% of oil at the top of the transition zone, and that's when you've reached SWIR. So your fractional flow above the transition zone will be 100% oil. And of course, once you're in the oil leg, you will assume that SW is now fixed at SWIR, and the oil is in continuous phase, of course, and the fractional flow will be 100% oil and 0% water. So because you've got these fluctuations in terms of where you pick SWIR and where you pick the oil-water contact, and of course the oil-water contact, whatever saturation will be at your chosen oil-water contact will, by definition, also be your SOR. In other words, that's the maximum amount of oil that you can displace. And you can see that it can move and it can change because it's arbitrary. But you can see that that is all related to the relative permeability curve. If you're looking at the permeability curve on the right-hand side, and that would be one that would be for a given rock type, you can see that at the top of the transition zone, you can see that your capillary, your relative permeability curve will tell you that you will be flowing 100% oil and 0% water, which is exactly what the top of the transition means. And at the oil-water contact, you have made the decision that at that saturation, which is where the oil-water contact is, which you have chosen, you will flow no oil, only water. Even if you simply assume that once the saturation reaches that point and at that height, you will be flowing nothing but water. And that's why you call it the oil-water contact, which, as you can see from this figure, is actually some height above above the free water level. So when you're looking at this figure, remember that the free water level is fixed and it's very accurate and should be very precise because it's the intersection between two gradients. The irreducible water, the oil water contact, and the irreducible oil saturation are arbitrary numbers, and they can vary. That's why I put these little red arrows that move around, because these can change. The one that is fixed is the free water level. And of course, as you move the oil water contact, as you feel, you can see that it immediately has an impact on your relative permeability curve. So here's a relative permeability curve for a very good rock, 35% porosity. You can see that the irreducible water saturation is very low, about 10%. And you can see that your fractional flow of oil is high, obviously. And you can see that the water takes a while before it starts moving. And as you're going, and as your water saturation is increasing, as you're going, as your production is continuing, you can see that ultimately you will produce no oil when you've got an SOR of about 85%. So that's pretty good displacement, and you can see that there you will flow only water. If you're looking
at your voice, Jean-Marie, excuse me, your voice sometimes is a little bit low.
All right, I'll speak more into the microphone, sorry.
Yes, please.
So if you're now looking at this reservoir, which is a poor reservoir, it's relatively tight, it's 10%, you can see that the end point is now actually quite a lot lower. In other words, it's about 0.79 in terms of relative permeability. But you can see that SWIR, irreducible, has come way down as well. And you can see that water will start appearing very quickly, and ultimately you will be flowing water at relatively low saturation. So that's a rock where you'll have relatively low oil displacement. In other words, you will leave a lot of oil behind compared to the previous one, where you can see that you will be producing a lot more oil over a much bigger span of saturations. So what is the impact of all that? Well, this is an example. This is a field it's a schematic, but it's a field in Libya, a supergiant field. And you can see that in this example, you have a free water level, but you can see that you've got layered reservoirs with quite variable porosities and permeabilities. If you're looking at the lower reservoir, you can see that you're looking at porosities of about 30% and permeabilities of 200 millidarcy. The one above is 10% and 5 millidarcy, and then the reservoirs above are sort of intermediate. And what you see is that you've got a free water level, then you've got an oil water contact, which is different. Even though everything is hydraulically connected, you can see that the oil water contact is different for each of the reservoirs, as shown on the solid horizontal black line. And then you've got a transition zone. In other words, that's the interval, once again, that goes between the oil water contact to the top of the transition, which is highlighted in gray, which is also quite variable. So if you were to drill a well second from the right, you can see that where you are perforating, at the very top, you would be producing 100% oil. In the transition zone, which is in the gray zone, you'd be producing water and oil. And then as you go deeper, you'd be producing oil again at 100%, and then water and oil together until you hit the zone which is below the oil water contact, and you'd be producing water. Now, if you look at the well on the right-hand side, which has been perforated over a greater interval, but certainly over the same intervals that have been perforated there, you can see that where you were producing 100% water or water and oil, like at the base, you can see that on the right-hand side, you will be producing 100% oil. So in the same reservoir, same hydraulic system, simply because of the transition zone, one well could be producing water, while a well some distance away would be producing 100% oil. And that's quite important in terms of where you set your perforations, obviously, as you don't necessarily want to perforate transition zone, but also in terms of watering out the wells. So you can see that it is quite possible and quite easy to have wells which will be producing water at a certain depth, while in another part of the reservoir at the same depth, but in better reservoirs, will be producing 100% oil. You can also see in this schematic that the oil-water contact is varying quite significantly between the different reservoir layers. And obviously, you cannot and you could not, in this example, put a single oil-water contact, which is valid for all 4 reservoirs, without either adding a lot of water to your volumetrics or removing that. So you've got to look at where your oil-water contacts are for these different intervals, so that when you're calculating your volumetrics and you're doing your computation, especially for the volumes initially in place, you'd have to take that into account, or you could introduce significant errors. And obviously, because of the perforation and because of the recoveries, depending on whether you are in the transition zone or not, your ultimate recovery will also be affected by that. So just to say it again, at the same depth, some wells could produce 100% water. They could be producing water and oil, or even dry oil, even though, as I said, the reservoir is hydraulically connected. Now, this is a slide that I wanted to put in because I have seen many times errors where the free water level and the oil-water contact are sometimes confused, and sometimes the oil-water contact, like in this example here, that's the reality on the left-hand side. So you have a free water level at some depth, and you've got an oil-water contact, which is shown as oil-water contact 0,1. And you can see that if from your simulator you assume that the free water level is the same as the oil-water contact, as is shown on the plot on the right-hand side, which would be your input in terms of your simulation, you can see that you would be missing 25 meters of transition. And this is an example of exactly that. And you can see that if you have put the capillary pressure, in other words, the free water level at 2,600 meters, you can see that you would be calculating, in this example, 730 million barrels of oil, when in fact you've got 792. In other words, you would have missed about 60 million, which is really not quite 10%. So it can be very significant, and this is one of the key takeaways that you should have, is that you need to determine very precisely where your free water level is and where the top of the oil-water contact is, so that you replicate in your model the correct transition intervals. Obviously, it has another impact, is that if you've actually modeled the transition zone in the wrong place, you could get your perforations totally wrong, which would be very expensive, of course, if you do that. So I just want to conclude here. The free water level, as I say, is fixed, and that's the one anchor point we have when we're looking at fluid contact, especially at transition. It's precise and it's accurate. So, that's your anchor point. The capillary transition zone is an interval which is between the free water level and the height, where SW is equal to SWIR, in other words, irreducible water saturation, and where oil will flow at 100%. In other words, the fractional flow will be 100% oil. The oil-water contact is somewhere above the free water level within the transition interval, and it is simply some height above the free water level where you estimate that anything between the free water level and this oil-water contact will be negligible. In other words, you will simply ignore it. And you take your oil-water contact where you believe that you will be able to recover significant amount of oil. What is significant is entirely up to the user. If you think that 90% water and 10% oil is acceptable, that's where you would put your oil water contact. And of course, that would be quite valid if you were onshore Texas, where drilling the wells are very cheap. If you are offshore deep water, you'd have to be a lot more careful in accepting that you could be producing 90% water and 10% oil. So these the placement of the oil water contact will vary very much on the rock type, but also on where you are and what is the economic cutoff. Oil water contact is some height above the free water level where the oil becomes noticeably mobile. That height depends very much on the capillary effect and the reservoir quality. As I said, capillary effect is entirely dependent on the contrast between the density of water and oil. Really, the height of the oil-water contact is simply a factor of the rock. Oil-water contact is an arbitrary decision. The user decides. The interval between the free water level and the oil-water contact, you will make an assumption that it will flow 100%. In other words, you will not take any oil that you could produce from that into account, and that means you would not put perforations or any recovery in that interval. We don't normally have transition at gas-oil contact, mainly because gas does not have a capillary effect. The transition interval has major impact on the volumetrics, on the dynamic simulation, especially the initialization, positioning of horizontal drains, positioning of perforation intervals. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Jean-Marie, for the nice and very interesting presentation. This is actually the basic concepts that most of the reservoir engineers had challenged with understanding that. But thank you for the very nice explanation, simple explanation, and very informative. Now we reach to the end of the webinar and hope you enjoyed it. Please do not forget to visit our website, subscribe Petro-Teach YouTube channel, and download our catalog. We are pleased to give discount for the group and PhD students also. Thanks everyone, and hope to see you soon in our courses and webinars. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, and goodbye to everyone.